Dr. Elise Harper was used to long, grueling days. As one of the most skilled cardiovascular surgeons in the city, her workday stretched well beyond what anyone would consider reasonable. But for Elise, her job wasn't just a career, it was a calling. She had spent her entire life fighting to earn a place in an environment that was traditionally dominated by men and, more specifically, white men. Tonight was no different. After a marathon 16-hour shift that had included 2 emergency surgeries, Elise finally found herself walking down the quiet hallways of Westmont Medical Center, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair pulled back into a simple bun, and her movements unhurried. All she wanted was to grab a cup of coffee and retreat to her office for a few minutes of peace before heading home. The hospital at this hour was quieter than usual. The bustling daytime activity had faded into the stillness of night, punctuated only by the occasional sound of a gurney's wheels squeaking against the polished floor, or the faint murmur of voices from the emergency department. Elise loved these moments of calm. The chaos of the operating room was where she thrived, but these hushed hallways gave her space to breathe, to think, and to remind herself why she did what she did. As she approached the staff lounge, her attention was drawn to a commotion coming from the ER waiting area. A man's voice, loud, impatient, and tinged with irritation, echoed through the corridor. Elise hesitated for a moment, debating whether to investigate or simply move on. Curiosity won. As she rounded the corner, she saw the source of the disruption. Officer Mitch Dawson stood near the nurse's station, his arms crossed and his expression set in a scowl. Dawson was a man who commanded attention, though not always in a positive way. In his early 50s, he was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence both imposing and intimidating. His thinning hair was slicked back, and his uniform was crisp, though the stress of his day seemed to have wrinkled his temper. Mitch was the type of man who exuded authority. Whether it was earned or simply demanded was another question entirely. Tonight, his eye was directed at a young nurse who appeared flustered and cornered by his aggressive demeanor. "This is taking too damn long," Mitch barked, his voice carrying down the hallway. "I brought my partner in over an hour ago, and he's still sitting there waiting." "What kind of hospital are you running here?" The nurse, a petite woman named Lauren, who had only been working at Westmont for 6 months, stammered as she tried to explain. "Sir, the doctors are prioritizing critical cases first. I understand your frustration, but—" "Don't tell me about priorities," Mitch interrupted, his tone sharp. "I've been on my feet for 12 hours dealing with goddamn criminals, and the least you people can do is show a little respect for law enforcement." Elise felt her jaw tighten. She had seen men like Mitch before, men who believed their authority gave them the right to dominate every room they entered. She had faced that kind of arrogance throughout her career, and she had learned to confront it with calm precision. But tonight she was too tired for a confrontation. She decided to walk past, hoping to avoid drawing his attention. Unfortunately, Mitch noticed her. His sharp eyes locked onto her figure as she moved toward the coffee station in the corner of the lounge. Something about her casual demeanor and the fact that she wasn't wearing a white coat, just standard scrubs, seemed to irritate him. To him, she didn't look like a doctor. She looked like someone who worked in maintenance or housekeeping, someone who should be hustling to clean up the mess he thought this hospital had become. "Hey," Mitch called out, his voice cutting through the room. Elise stopped but didn't immediately turn around. "Are you deaf? I'm talking to you." She turned slowly, meeting his gaze with an expression of quiet exhaustion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone neutral but firm. Mitch took a step closer, his irritation palpable. "Yeah, you can help by doing your damn job. The waiting area's a mess, and nobody seems to care that patients are being left to rot out there. Maybe instead of wandering around, you should grab a mop or something." Elise blinked, her face betraying none of the anger that surged through her chest. She had dealt with men like this her whole life, men who assumed her worth based on her appearance, men who dismissed her intelligence and skill before she even opened her mouth. Tonight, though, she didn't have the energy to argue. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said calmly. "If you have concerns about the waiting area, I suggest you take them up with the front desk." Mitch's face darkened. He didn't like her tone, nor did he appreciate what he perceived as defiance. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "I know exactly what I'm looking at. You think you're too good to do your job, walking around here like you own the place." Elise felt her patience thinning. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain composed. "I suggest you watch your tone, officer," she said evenly. "You're making assumptions you'll regret." Mitch scoffed, his laugh bitter and sharp. "Oh, really? And what exactly are you going to do about it?" Before Elise could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Dr. Harper, you're needed in OR3 stat." Elise turned to see a resident rushing toward her, his expression urgent. She gave Mitch one last look, her eyes steady and unyielding. "You'll find out soon enough," she said quietly before walking away. Mitch stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. "Doctor," he muttered under his breath, watching as Elise disappeared down the hallway. He felt a flicker of doubt, but his pride quickly smothered it. She couldn't possibly be a doctor. Not someone like her. Not here. As the minutes passed and Mitch's partner was finally called back for treatment, Mitch tried to shake off the strange encounter. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind told him he had made a mistake, one that he wouldn't fully understand until it was far too late. The emergency room at Westmont Medical Center was chaos, as always. Stretchers lined the walls, and the low hum of monitors was punctuated by the occasional cry of a patient in pain or a nurse barking orders. Dr. Elise Harper walked briskly through the commotion toward operating room 3, her exhaustion temporarily overridden by the surge of adrenaline that came with every new case. Surgery was her domain, her battlefield, and no matter how physically drained she felt, her mind sharpened the moment she stepped through those double doors. The case she was called for was a critical one, a young man in his 20s who had been in a motorcycle accident. His injuries were severe. His chest caved in from the impact, and his vitals were unstable. Elise took command the moment she entered, her calm voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "Let's get him prepped. I want full imaging up on the monitors in 60 seconds, and someone page cardiology for backup. Move." As the surgical team scrambled to follow her orders, Elise focused on the task at hand. The memory of her confrontation with Officer Mitch Dawson in the lounge was already fading. She had no room in her mind for his ignorance or arrogance, not now, not ever. But while Elise was saving one life, another was about to take a sharp turn. Back in the ER waiting area, Mitch sat in a rigid plastic chair, his arms crossed over his chest. His partner, Officer Ted Grayson, was finally being seen by a doctor for a sprained wrist and minor lacerations sustained during a traffic stop gone wrong. Mitch was left to wait alone, his irritation simmering just beneath the surface. He hated hospitals, hated the smells, the sounds, the way the staff seemed to move at their own pace, as if time weren't a luxury for everyone else. Most of all, he hated how that woman, whoever she was, had spoken to him earlier. The audacity of it still gnawed at him. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp pain in his chest. At first, it was just a dull ache, something he chalked up to stress or indigestion. But within seconds, the pain intensified, radiating out to his left arm and jaw. Mitch's breathing grew labored, his vision blurred, and cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He clutched his chest, his mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. "Hey, somebody help." Mitch managed to croak, his voice weak and strained. A nearby nurse turned at the sound and rushed to his side, her eyes widening as she saw his ashen face and trembling hands. "Sir, are you experiencing chest pain?" she asked, already motioning for a stretcher. "Yeah," Mitch gasped, his voice barely audible. "It's bad. Feels like something's crushing me. Get him to trauma 1. The nurse called out, and within moments, Mitch was surrounded by a flurry of activity. He was wheeled into a private bay, where monitors were hooked up to his chest, IVs inserted into his arms, and an oxygen mask placed over his face. A doctor leaned over him, asking rapid-fire questions. "Any history of heart disease? Are you on any medications? How long has the pain been going on?" Mitch could barely focus on the words, the agony in his chest drowning out everything else. No heart problems," he wheezed. "I don't know, just started." The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse, their expressions grim. "Get cardiology down here now," the doctor said. "We're looking at a probable myocardial infarction." As Mitch faded in and out of consciousness, fragments of thoughts flickered through his mind. Was this how it ended? A heart attack in the middle of a hospital, surrounded by strangers. His breathing grew shallower, and for the first time in years, fear took root in his chest, eclipsing even the pain. He wanted to call out, to demand answers, to insist that someone fix this, but he was powerless. The next thing Mitch knew, he was being wheeled through a maze of corridors. The overhead lights blurred into streaks of white as the gurney moved at a rapid pace. He could hear snippets of voices around him. "Get Dr. Harper! She's the best we've got!" "She's still in surgery. Page her again. We don't have time." Mitch's mind latched onto the name. Harper. It sounded familiar, but his thoughts were too scattered to make the connection. His chest felt like it was on fire, and every beat of his heart sent shockwaves of pain through his body. The world around him seemed to tilt and sway, the edges of his vision darkening. Finally, the gurney came to a halt, and Mitch was lifted onto an operating table. The bright overhead lights of the surgical suite burned his eyes, and the voices around him became sharper and more urgent. What's his status? BP's dropping. Heart rates all over the place. We need to stabilize him before we lose him. Mitch turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on a figure standing near the door. She was putting on a surgical gown, her movements swift and practiced. For a moment she looked up, and their eyes met. It was her. The woman from the lounge. The one he had dismissed and humiliated not an hour ago. Mitch's chest tightened further, not from the heart attack, but from the cold realization that swept over him. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a janitor. She was the one who would decide whether he lived or died. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His vision blurred again, and the last thing he heard before the darkness claimed him was her voice, calm and steady. "Let's get to work." Elise stepped into the OR, her face a mask of focus and determination. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't let the weight of the situation affect her. To her, Mitch Dawson was just another patient, one in desperate need of her skills. Whatever had happened between them earlier was irrelevant now. All that mattered was the work. But somewhere deep in her mind, a small voice whispered, "This man judged you, belittled you, and now he's lying on this table, completely at your mercy. How ironic." Elise silenced the thought as quickly as it came. There was no room for emotion here, no room for anything but precision. She glanced at the monitors, taking in the dire state of his heart, and began issuing commands to her team. Scalpel. Let's open him up. As the first incision was made, Elise felt the familiar rhythm of the surgery take over. The room faded away, the tension melted into focus, and all that remained was the delicate dance between life and death. Mitch's heart was failing. But Elise Harper was not one to lose battles, not today, not ever. The operating room was as cold as ever, with the harsh fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the surgical team. Dr. Elise Harper, calm as stone, stood at the head of the table, commanding every movement in the room. The man lying on the table, Officer Mitch Dawson, was inches from death. His heart, once overworked and riddled with signs of years of unchecked stress, was now literally in her hands. The incision revealed a grim sight: ruptured vessels, clotted blood pooling in his chest cavity, and a heart straining to beat. For anyone else, this might have been overwhelming, but for Elise, it was just another day. Her focus was razor sharp, her hands steady as she worked with precision and speed. The monitors beeped erratically, signaling that Mitch was deteriorating. Pressures dropping fast. One of the nurses called, her voice high-pitched with worry. "We're down to 55/30. "Clamp the bleeder," Elise snapped, not even looking up. The nurse handed her the necessary instrument. "Increase fluids, get those numbers up." Despite her outward calm, the tension in the room was palpable. Mitch's heart was barely holding on. One wrong move, one hesitation, and it would be over. Elise knew this better than anyone, but her hands moved like they had no doubt. Every step was calculated, deliberate. "Prepare another dose of epinephrine," she said. "And I want that transfusion ready to go on my count." The team scrambled to keep up with her, their movements quick but not chaotic. Elise had a reputation for being demanding in the OR, but it wasn't because she wanted to intimidate people. She demanded excellence because anything less could cost lives. And tonight, it wasn't just any life she was trying to save, it was the life of the man who had humiliated her just hours before. The thought of Mitch's sneer flashed in her mind for a split second. "You think you're too good to do your job?" His voice echoed, dripping with disdain. It was the kind of tone she'd heard her whole life, the kind that people used when they thought they were better than her simply because of the color of her skin. "Dr. Harper." One of the residents interrupted her thoughts. He hesitated, as if afraid to question her. "Do you think we need to?" "I think you need to follow my lead," Elise interrupted sharply. "Focus on what I'm asking you to do, not what you think I might be missing." The resident swallowed and nodded quickly, his eyes dropping back to the instruments in front of him. Elise didn't have time to explain herself, nor did she feel obligated to. This wasn't a classroom, this was life and death. The room buzzed with activity. The anesthesiologist adjusted Mitch's oxygen levels, the perfusionist monitored the blood flow, and the nurses moved seamlessly around the table. The only constant was Elise, her presence, her voice, her unshakable command of the situation. She issued instructions with the kind of authority that came from years of experience, but also from something deeper, the knowledge that she had to be twice as good, twice as competent, to be seen as equal in this field. Pressure stabilizing, the anesthesiologist reported, his voice tinged with relief. "We're back to 70/50. "Not good enough," Elise replied. "We need to get him higher. How's the heart looking?" "It's still weak," said one of the nurses, "but it's holding." Elise nodded, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the rupture she was trying to repair. Her hands moved deftly, stitching the torn vessel with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, but she didn't falter. She couldn't. Failure wasn't an option, not for Mitch Dawson, and not for her. As the minutes ticked by, the tension began to ease. The monitors showed steady improvement, and Mitch's heart, while still fragile, was beginning to beat with more consistency. Elise finished the repair and leaned back slightly, letting out a quiet breath. "Close him up," she said, her tone firm but calm. "We're done here." The surgical team sprang into action, carefully closing the incision and preparing Mitch for transfer to the ICU. Elise stepped away from the table, stripping off her gloves and gown before heading to the scrub sink. The adrenaline that had carried her through the surgery was starting to wear off, leaving behind a familiar exhaustion. But there was no time to rest, not yet. As she scrubbed her hands, one of the nurses approached her cautiously. It was Grace, a senior nurse who had worked with Elise for years. Grace was one of the few people who knew Elise well enough to speak freely, even in moments like this. "You did good in there," Grace said quietly. "As always." Elise didn't respond immediately. She kept her eyes on the sink, watching the water swirl down the drain. Finally, she said, "It's not about me. It's about the patient." Grace hesitated, then added, "I know who that patient is. I saw what happened in the lounge earlier." Elise's jaw tightened, but she didn't look up. "It doesn't matter," she said evenly. "I did my job. That's all that matters." "Doesn't it, though?" Grace pressed gently. "He treated you like garbage, and now he owes you his life. That's got to count for something." Elise turned off the faucet and reached for a towel. She dried her hands slowly, her movement deliberate. "It doesn't count for anything," she said. "What he owes me is his business, not mine. I did what I was trained to do, and now it's up to him to figure out what to do with that." Grace watched her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "You're a better person than I am," she said with a faint smile. "I don't think I could have done it." Elise didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. Meanwhile, in the ICU, Mitch was beginning to stir. The anesthesia was wearing off, and his mind was foggy, but he could feel the dull ache in his chest and the heaviness of his body. His eyes fluttered open, and he blinked against the harsh light of the room. For a moment, he didn't know where he was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back, the heart attack, the surgery, and her. Mitch's breath hitched as the memory of Elise Harper's face flashed in his mind. He remembered the way she had looked at him in the lounge, calm but unyielding. He remembered the way he had dismissed her, the way he had assumed she was beneath him. And now, the realization hit him like a truck. She had saved him. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse. "It can't be." But it was. There was no denying it. Mitch's heart pounded weakly, but steadily as he grappled with the weight of what had happened. The woman he had treated with such disdain was the reason he was still alive. And for the first time in a long time, Mitch Dawson felt something he couldn't easily shake: shame. The door to his room opened, and a nurse stepped in to check his vitals. Mitch wanted to ask about Elise, to confirm what he already knew, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he lay there in silence, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to process the truth staring him in the face. All he knew was that he owed her something he might never be able to repay. The EQ hummed softly with the rhythmic beeping of machines, the faint whispers of nurses checking charts, and the low hum of the ventilators. Officer Mitch Dawson lay motionless in his hospital bed, his body still weak and his mind racing. His chest ached not just from the surgery, but from the crushing weight of realization that was settling in. The woman he had dismissed, belittled, and insulted just hours ago had been the one to save his life. Dr. Elise Harper. Her name felt like a stone in his throat every time he thought it. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the moment in the lounge when he'd barked at her to grab a mop. His face burned with shame. He'd seen her as a nobody, just another person to bulldoze over with his authority. Now, lying here, helpless, he couldn't escape the irony of it all. He had spent his entire life seeing the world in black and white, those who deserved respect and those who didn't. And yet the person he had treated as unworthy had been the one to save him when he was at his weakest. The door to his room opened, and Mitch's heart rate spiked as Elise Harper herself stepped inside. She was dressed in her usual surgical scrubs, her hair pulled back into a practical bun. She carried a tablet in one hand, her expression calm and professional. Mitch's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say, how to start, or if he even could. Her presence alone felt like a reminder of everything he'd done wrong. "Good evening, Officer Dawson," she said, her tone cool but not unkind. "How are you feeling?" Mitch swallowed hard. His voice came out rough and uneven. I'm okay, I guess. Still alive." "That's a good start," Elise replied, glancing at the monitor by his bed. Her gaze was steady, clinical, but there was an edge of something else in her eyes, something that made Mitch feel small and exposed. "Your vitals are improving. We're keeping a close watch for any post-operative complications, but so far, everything looks stable." Mitch nodded, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to thank her, to apologize, to say something that would make up for what he had done. But the words felt stuck in his chest, buried beneath layers of pride and shame. I didn't know," he stammered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Elise raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know what?" "That you were a doctor," Mitch admitted, his eyes darting away from hers. "When I saw you in the lounge, I thought." He stopped, the weight of his own words hanging in the air. "You thought I didn't belong," Elise finished for him, her voice calm but firm. "You thought you could judge me based on what I looked like, or how tired I was, or whatever assumptions you made in that moment." Mitch flinched at her bluntness, but he couldn't deny it. She was right. Every word she said was true. "I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I shouldn't have." Elise held up a hand, cutting him off. "Officer Dawson, let me make something clear. I didn't save your life because I wanted an apology. I didn't do it to prove a point or to make you feel bad. I did it because it's my job. It's what I'm trained to do. Your personal feelings about me or anyone else in this hospital don't matter when you're on my table." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no anger in her tone, no gloating, no attempt to rub his mistakes in his face. But the truth of what she was saying was impossible to ignore. "I understand," Mitch said quietly, though he wasn't sure he did. Not entirely. How could someone be so professional, so composed, after everything he'd said and done? He didn't deserve her compassion, he didn't even deserve her attention. And yet, here she was, checking on him, ensuring his recovery, treating him with the same care and respect she would give to anyone else. Elise studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more. Finally, she nodded. "Rest is critical for your recovery. I'll be back to check on you tomorrow." She turned to leave, but before she could reach the door, Mitch's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, his tone almost desperate. "Please." She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him. I don't know how to, thank you," Mitch said, stumbling over his words. "For what you did, for saving me." Elise's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained resolute. "You're welcome," she said simply. "But gratitude means nothing if it doesn't come with action. Think about that while you're recovering." With that, she left the room, leaving Mitch alone with his thoughts. Her parting words echoed in his mind, intertwining with the memory of her steady hands and calm voice in the OR. Gratitude means nothing if it doesn't come with action. As the hours passed, Mitch found himself replaying the events of the past day over and over. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elise's face calm, focused, unyielding. He saw her in the OR, working tirelessly to save his life, and he saw her in the lounge enduring his insults without flinching. The contrast was almost too much to bear. But it wasn't just Elise he thought about. His mind drifted to other moments in his life, other times when he had made snap judgments, dismissed people, or treated them as less than human. He thought about the young black man he had pulled over last week for a broken taillight, the way he had assumed the worst simply because of the car he was driving. He thought about the Latina mother he had shouted at in a grocery store parking lot when her toddler accidentally bumped into him. He thought about all the people he had looked down on, all the times he had used his badge as an excuse to assert his superiority. The weight of those memories pressed down on him, suffocating and inescapable. For the first time in his life, Mitch began to see himself through someone else's eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. Meanwhile, Elise sat in her office, staring at the stack of paperwork in front of her. She should have been focused on the charts and reports that demanded her attention, but her mind kept drifting back to Mitch Dawson. She had done her job, she had saved his life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something unresolved. Grace's words from earlier echoed in her mind. He owes you his life. That's got to count for something. But Elise didn't want gratitude, and she certainly didn't want pity. What she wanted was change. She wanted men like Mitch Dawson to look at the world differently, to treat people with respect, to see beyond their own biases. She wanted him to understand that the assumptions he had made about her weren't just wrong, they were dangerous. Because if he could make those assumptions about her, a surgeon who had dedicated her life to saving others, what other judgments was he making? And what harm had those judgments caused? Elise sighed and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. She didn't know if Mitch Dawson was capable of change, but she hoped he was. Because if he wasn't, then what was the point of any of this? Mitch Dawson had spent his life defining himself by his authority. His badge wasn't just a tool, it was his armor, a shield against the vulnerabilities he worked so hard to hide. For years he had built a persona around control over his surroundings, over the people he encountered, and, most of all, over how others saw him. But here, in this hospital bed, stripped of everything that gave him power, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades: helplessness. The past few days had been a blur of pain, nurses coming and going, and the endless and monotonous hum of machines. Each beep of the heart monitor reminded him of his fragility. Every aching breath was a reminder that he was alive solely because of the skill and determination of a woman he had wronged in ways he couldn't even fully articulate. Dr. Elise Harper had visited his room once since the surgery. Her demeanor had been professional, her tone even, but there had been an undercurrent of something else, something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. She had saved his life, but she hadn't offered him comfort or reassurance. There had been no platitudes, no soft words of encouragement. Instead, she had been precise, almost clinical. And yet, beneath her detached professionalism, Mitch had sensed the weight of unspoken truths. She didn't need to say it out loud for him to know she hadn't forgotten what had happened in the lounge. Mitch replayed that moment in his mind over and over again. He remembered the way he had barked at her, the way he had dismissed her without a second thought. "Grab a mop," he had said, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. He had looked at her, made a snap judgment, and spoken as though he had the right to dictate her worth. And now, that same woman had held his life in her hands. The shame was suffocating. He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the mundane details of his recovery, the number of steps he could take without feeling lightheaded, the bitter taste of the hospital food, the cold stiffness of the sheets. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind kept circling back to her. He thought about her steady hands in the OR, her calm voice as she directed the surgical team, her sharp eyes that seemed to see through every pretense. She had saved him without hesitation, without letting his actions cloud her judgment. She had shown him a level of grace and professionalism that he didn't deserve. The door to his room opened, and Mitch's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought it might be Elise again, but it was only a nurse. She was young, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, but she didn't linger. She checked his vitals, noted something on his chart, and left without a word. Mitch couldn't help but notice the way she avoided meeting his gaze. He wondered if she knew. Did the entire hospital staff know what had happened in the lounge? Did they see him as the man who had insulted their most respected surgeon? The thought made his stomach churn. He shifted in the bed, wincing as pain lanced through his chest. His body was healing, but his pride was another matter entirely. Mitch Dawson wasn't used to being on the receiving end of judgment. He had spent his career in law enforcement, wielding his authority like a weapon, assuming that his position gave him the right to decide who mattered and who didn't. But now, lying here, vulnerable and exposed, he felt the sting of being seen for what he truly was. The door opened again, and this time it was her. Dr. Harper stepped into the room, her clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable. She was dressed in her usual scrubs, her hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun. Mitch felt his pulse quicken, a fact made embarrassingly obvious by the spike on the heart monitor. Elise glanced at the screen, but didn't comment. "Good afternoon, Officer Dawson," she said, her tone polite but distant. "How are you feeling today?" Mitch cleared his throat, his voice rough and uneven. "Better," he said. "Thanks to you." Elise nodded, making a note on her clipboard. "Your recovery is progressing as expected. No signs of infection, and your heart function is improving. If this trend continues, we should be able to discharge you within a few days." Her words were precise, factual. There was no trace of warmth or sympathy, but there was also no hostility. Mitch didn't know what to make of it. He had expected her to be angry, to confront him about what had happened in the lounge. Instead, she seemed detached. It was almost worse than anger. "Dr. Harper," he began hesitantly, I need to say something." She looked up from her clipboard, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Go ahead." Mitch swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I owe you an apology for what happened in the lounge, for the way I treated you. I was out of line." Elise tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him squirm. "Yes," she said simply. "You were." Her bluntness took him by surprise, but he nodded. "I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" she interrupted, her tone calm but cutting. "Didn't mean to treat me like I didn't belong here. It didn't mean to make assumptions about me based on how I looked. Or didn't mean to get caught." Mitch flinched at her words, the weight of her gaze pressing down on him. "I didn't mean any harm," he said weakly, though he knew how hollow the words sounded. Elise's expression didn't soften. "You didn't mean any harm," she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Do you have any idea how often I hear that? How often people like you excuse their behavior by saying they didn't mean any harm, as if your intentions erase the impact of your actions?" Mitch felt his face flush with shame. He wanted to argue, to explain himself, but he knew she was right. Everything she said was true, and there was no excuse for it. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I mean it." Elise studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something sincerity, perhaps, or resolve. Finally, she sighed and set the clipboard down on the edge of the bed. "Apologies are easy, Officer Dawson," she said. "They're just words, and words don't mean much if they aren't followed by action." Mitch nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "How do I make this right?" Elise tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "That's not for me to tell you," she said. "But if you're serious about changing, start by looking at yourself. Ask yourself why you felt so comfortable treating me the way you did. Ask yourself how many other people you've treated the same way, and then do the work to be better." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Mitch had always seen himself as a good man, someone who was fair and just. But now, lying here, he realized how shallow that self-image had been. He thought about the young black man he had pulled over last week, how quickly he had assumed the worst simply because of the car he was driving. He thought about all the times he had used his badge to assert his authority, all the people he had judged without even realizing it. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I don't know if I even know how to start." Elise's gaze softened slightly, though her posture remained firm. "Change isn't easy, Officer Dawson," she said. "It's uncomfortable. It's messy. But if you're serious about it, you'll find a way." She picked up her clipboard and turned toward the door. "You have a second chance. Don't waste it." With that, she left the room, leaving Mitch alone with his thoughts. The silence felt suffocating, the beeping of the heart monitor a constant reminder of the life he had been given back. Mitch stared at the ceiling, her words replaying in his mind over and over. "Ask yourself why. Do the work. Be better." For the first time in his life, Mitch Dawson felt the full weight of his actions, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could carry it. The air in the hospital felt heavier than usual, as if the weight of unspoken truths and unresolved conflicts had seeped into the walls. Mitch Dawson sat upright in his bed, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. The vibrant movement of cars and people seemed alien to him now. He had always been a part of that world, a figure of authority and control. But here, in this sterile room, he felt like an outsider looking in. Days had passed since Dr. Elise Harper last visited him, and her words still echoed in his mind. "Ask yourself why. Do the work. Be better." He had spent countless hours replaying their conversation, her calm yet cutting demeanor, the way she had laid bare the flaws he had spent his entire life ignoring. Mitch wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such scrutiny, and the realization of his own biases was a bitter pill to swallow. He thought about his career, the countless interactions he'd had as a police officer. How many times had he made snap judgments? How many lives had he impacted negatively without even realizing it? The young black man he had pulled over for no reason other than a suspicious-looking car. The woman in the grocery store he had barked at for blocking the aisle with her children. The countless people whose humanity he had overlooked in his rush to assert his own authority. And then there was Elise Harper, a woman whose intelligence and skill far surpassed anything Mitch could claim for himself. Yet he had reduced her to a stereotype in the span of a few seconds. The shame was suffocating. The door to his room opened, and Mitch turned his head, half expecting to see Elise again. But it wasn't her. It was Officer Ted Grayson, Mitch's partner, his arm still in a sling from the injuries that had brought them to the hospital in the first place. Ted stepped inside, his usual cocky grin replaced by a look of concern. "Mitch," Ted said, his voice low. How are you holding up? Mitch shrugged, wincing at the movement. Alive, he muttered. That's about all I can say. Ted pulled up a chair beside the bed, studying Mitch closely. I've been hearing things, he said after a moment. About that surgeon who operated on you. Harper, right? Mitch's stomach twisted at the mention of her name. What about her? Ted hesitated, glancing at the door as if to make sure no one was listening. Word around the hospital is you had some kind of altercation with her before the surgery. People are talking. Mitch. They're saying you said some things. Did some things. Mitch felt his face flush with embarrassment. He wanted to deny it, to tell Ted it wasn't true, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he looked away, his silence speaking volumes. Damn it, Mitch, Ted said, his tone a mix of frustration and disbelief. What were you thinking? Harper's a damn hero in this place. People respect her, admire her. And you, what? Treated her like some second-rate intern. I didn't know who she was, Mitch said weakly, though he knew how pathetic the excuse sounded. I didn't know she was a surgeon. That's the problem. Ted shot back. You shouldn't have to know someone's title to treat them with respect. You're lucky she didn't walk away and let someone else handle your surgery. She could have let you die, Mitch. The words hit harder than Mitch expected, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. Ted was right. Elise could have walked away. She could have let her pride or her anger dictate her actions, but she hadn't. She had saved him, even though he didn't deserve it. I know, Mitch said finally, his voice barely audible. I know I screwed up. Ted leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. You didn't just screw up, Mitch. You showed your true colors. And now you've got to live with that. The two men sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of Ted's words settling over them like a shroud. Mitch felt like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of his own failings. He had always thought of himself as a good person, someone who fought for justice and did the right thing. But now, he wasn't so sure. Maybe he had been fooling himself all along. Later that evening, as the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, Mitch found himself alone with his thoughts once again. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the room, and the beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound to break the silence. He was about to close his eyes and try to sleep when the door opened once more. It was Elise. She stepped inside quietly, her expression as composed as ever. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, studying him with those sharp, penetrating eyes. Mitch felt his pulse quicken, the heart monitor betraying his reaction. Elise glanced at the screen, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. I see you're still alive, she said, her tone laced with dry humor. Mitch couldn't help but chuckle, though the movement sent a sharp pain through his chest. Thanks to you, he said. I don't think I've said that enough. Elise raised an eyebrow. You've said it plenty, she replied. What matters is whether you've learned anything. Mitch swallowed hard, her words cutting through him like a scalpel. I have, he said after a moment. At least I think I have. Elise crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. Go on. Mitch took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. I've spent the last few days thinking about everything. About the way I treated you, the way I've treated other people in my life. I've made a lot of mistakes, Dr. Harper, and I know I can't fix them overnight. But I want to try. I want to be better. Elise studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. Good, she said simply. That's a start. Mitch felt a flicker of hope at her words, but it was quickly tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Change never was. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was ready to face the challenge. As Elise turned to leave, Mitch called out to her, "Dr. Harper." She paused, looking back at him. "Thank you," he said again, his voice filled with sincerity. "Not just for saving my life, but for everything else." Elise smiled faintly, a hint of warmth breaking through her composed exterior. "You're welcome," she said. "But remember, Officer Dawson words mean nothing without action." With that, she walked out of the room, leaving Mitch alone once again. But this time the silence didn't feel so heavy. For the first time in his life, Mitch felt like he was on the path to something better. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he was ready to take the first step. The days since Mitch Dawson's release from the hospital had been quiet, but not peaceful. Recovery, both physical and mental, was proving to be more demanding than he had anticipated. The physical reminders were constant: the dull ache in his chest, the tightness when he moved too quickly, the simple fatigue that came from trying to do too much, too soon. But it was the mental strain that kept him awake at night. Each moment of silence brought with it the echo of Dr. Elise Harper's words, reverberating in his mind like a judge's gavel. "Apologies are easy, Officer Dawson. They're just words. Words mean nothing without action." Mitch had spent decades defining himself by his authority, by the weight of his badge and the power it afforded him. But now, he couldn't escape the realization of just how often he'd used that authority as a shield, as a weapon, as an excuse. He thought about his time in law enforcement, the people he had dismissed, the lives he had disrupted because of his own biases. He could no longer deny it. He had been part of the problem. And now, for the first time, he didn't know how to make it right. His days were a blur of small tasks and hesitant attempts at distraction. He would sit by the window for hours, staring out at the world as it moved on without him, wondering how he could possibly rejoin it as anything other than the man he had been. He pored over old case files, looking for patterns, for moments where his judgment had been clouded by prejudice. The answers were all there, staring him in the face, undeniable and deeply uncomfortable. Mitch had prided himself on being a man of action, someone who dealt with problems head-on, but this was a battle he didn't know how to fight. One afternoon, as he sifted through a stack of reports, he came across a name he hadn't thought about in years. The file was from an arrest he had made early in his career, a young black man accused of loitering outside a convenience store. Mitch remembered the incident clearly. The kid hadn't been doing anything wrong. He had been waiting for a friend to pick him up, but Mitch had decided, without evidence, that he was up to no good. The arrest hadn't stuck, but Mitch hadn't cared at the time. He had convinced himself that he had done the right thing, that his instincts had been justified. Now, looking at the file, Mitch felt a wave of shame wash over him. The young man's name was Darius Johnson, and Mitch wondered where he was now. Did Darius remember that day as vividly as Mitch did? Did he carry it with him, a scar left by a system that saw him as guilty until proven innocent? Mitch felt his chest tighten, not from the lingering effects of the surgery, but from the weight of his own guilt. He knew he couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but he couldn't ignore it either. A few days later, Mitch found himself standing in front of the hospital again. He hadn't planned on coming here. It had been a last-minute decision, born of restless pacing and the realization that he couldn't move forward without facing the person who had started him on this path. The automatic doors opened with a hiss, and Mitch stepped inside, the familiar smell of antiseptic triggering memories of his time as a patient. His chest ached as he made his way to the surgical wing, a sharp reminder of how close he had come to never walking through these halls again. When he reached Elise Harper's office, he hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear her voice inside, calm and precise as she spoke with a colleague. Mitch took a deep breath, steadying himself before knocking gently. The conversation paused, and a moment later, Elise's voice called out, "Come in." Mitch pushed the door open and stepped inside. Elise sat behind her desk, her hair pulled back as usual, her expression unreadable as she looked up at him. For a moment, the room was silent, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. "Officer Dawson," Elise said finally, her tone neutral. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." "I wasn't sure I'd come," Mitch admitted, his voice quiet. "But I needed to talk to you." Elise gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Have a seat." Mitch sat down, feeling uncomfortably exposed under her steady gaze. He fidgeted with his hands, struggling to find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began. "About why I treated you the way I did. About the kind of man I've been." Elise leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. And you were right," Mitch said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've spent my whole life making assumptions about people, judging them before I even know them. I let my biases control me in ways I didn't even realize. And it's hurt people. It's hurt a lot of people." Elise's gaze didn't waver. "So what do you plan to do about it?" Mitch swallowed hard, her question cutting through him like a blade. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been looking back at my cases, thinking about the people I've wronged. I know I can't fix everything, but I want to try. I want to be better." Elise nodded slowly, her expression softening slightly. "Acknowledging it is the first step," she said. "But it's just that, a step. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and it's not an easy one." "I know," Mitch said, "but I'm ready." For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. Finally, Elise stood and extended her hand. Mitch rose slowly, taking it in his own. "Good luck, Officer Dawson," she said. "I hope you mean what you say." "I do," Mitch said firmly. "Thank you, Dr. Harper, for everything." As Mitch left her office, he felt a strange sense of relief. The road ahead was uncertain, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. And though he didn't know where the path would lead, he was ready to take the first step. Over the next few months, Mitch began to rebuild his life. He enrolled in workshops on racial bias, sought out community groups to better understand the perspectives of those he had overlooked, and started volunteering at a local organization dedicated to criminal justice reform. It wasn't enough to erase his past mistakes, but it was a start. Each small act felt like a step toward redemption, a way to prove to himself and to others that he could change. Dr. Harper, meanwhile, continued her work at the hospital, saving lives and commanding respect with her quiet strength. She didn't hear from Mitch again, but she didn't need to. She had done her part, and now it was up to him to do the rest. And for the first time in his life, Mitch Dawson was determined to be better, not because he was expected to, but because he knew it was the right thing to do.